Hey guys, it's Bella, and I am back with Simon from History Debunked to do another week reading through an introduction to critical race theory. So, Simon, to go in, did you have any opening thoughts on power and the shape of knowledge?
Well, I can't help noticing that Delgado seems to confuse racism and nationalism a great deal. It's a bit tricky. He seems to switch seamlessly from talking about black people and white to speaking about Mexicans and Irish people. And racism and nationalism are two different things.
Yes, this is very true. I wonder if that's perhaps more of a US thing. I mean, I can say from my experience growing up in the UK, I don't think we in the UK treat, say, the Polish amazingly just because they're white. There may still be differences in how we treat them relative to, say, Afro Caribbeans or African immigrants or Chinese immigrants, but I think as a whole, we don't afford the Polish special privileges just because of their skin color. Whereas in America, maybe whiteness is more tied in with the idea of a national origin. Because to be fair to them, as they bring up in some of the cases, there have been white like cases in legal US history where skin color was framed as a national thing. You know what I mean?
I do, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a lot concerned with America. When I read through it, a lot of it didn't seem to be particularly applicable to this country.
To be sure, yeah. I mean, it's one of those things. But let's actually get into that. The black and white binary, the idea that they have, or they present, that some critical race theorists have, that blacks constitute the prototypical minority group. And this is an idea which I don't think Delgado likes very much, based on how he's writing about it here.
He
And there,
doesn't like it because he's not black himself. He's
well,
Mexican origin. And his only claim to be able to talk about critical race theory is his Latin origin. So obviously he doesn't want to see people focus too much upon black skins.
that's interesting. I mean, yeah, as he says, the history of how Latino identities have been conceived of within the northern United States as white or as not white is very interesting. But yeah, I put a little historical note there, that I found this confusing as well, that I was surprised to hear that most people, when they say mixed race, assume black by default. But yeah, so I think that that kind of paradigm certainly would not apply very well in the UK.
No, I agree.
And I think his objection to it is partly along the lines that in recent years we've started to pay attention to intersectionality and how different groups experience life in different ways. And this would also apply across national borders. So race in the US is going to function very differently from how it does here in the UK. And yeah, I think that's a fairly reasonable assumption. That's exactly what they're saying here in reacting to that, like be black as the prototypical racial minority, where they say exceptionalism holds that a group's history is so distinctive that placing it at the center of analysis is in fact warranted. But like we've said, he doesn't seem to like this. They had this quote about America cutting its eye teeth on discrimination against blacks. I would need to look into this more, but from my limited understanding, I think that the colonial and sort of biological racism that would go on to define the transatlantic slave trade, from my understanding, it actually has its origins in the Norman conquest of the Irish and the Welsh and how they sort of constructed these people as barbarous, but almost like intrinsically different and inferior in order to colonize Ireland and Wales, respectively. I mean, it's a discussion that's beyond the scope, I suppose, of our topic here. But I always find it interesting how, with the Irish and the Welsh, there absolutely is a colonial legacy there. But it's almost like it doesn't. Wales, for instance, doesn't often get subsumed into colonialist or anti-colonialist theory and discourse because it's been so far removed. Like in the case of, say, the Native Americans, it's been 500 years, or maybe 500 years, and then a lot of the sort of loss of indigenous culture would be in the last 300 years, whereas for the Welsh it's been over 500 years, a good deal longer. So we've almost forgotten that it happened. You know what I mean?
I do, yeah.
It's really interesting. But yeah, so I don't think there's anything too controversial about the differential racialization thesis that different racial groups will have different experiences. Fairly uncontroversial, I think. I put a note about with this quote about no science supports the practice of labeling people into different boxes, because I think this is something that's easy to misinterpret, and I just want to give like what I think my interpretation is, which is that I think what they're trying to say with this is that the scientific realities of populations and climatic groups and such, they don't match exactly onto our social categories of white, black, Asian, etc. I think that's what they're trying to get at
Yes,
there.
I think that's true. They couldn't possibly because everybody is mixed race. We all belong to mixed ethnicities.
Yeah.
There couldn't possibly be a complete match. The average African American has about 20% white ancestry. So, yeah, there's bound to be a lot of blurring and overlap.
Yeah. Um, so they've got more criticisms of the a purely black-white binary, saying that it oversimplifies analysis of race, which I think is very much true.
Mm.
It also weakens solidarity and reduces opportunities for coalition between different racial groups. It came up recently. I'm forgetting in which context. Have you heard of like quote unquote rooftop Koreans in California?
Go on.
So apparently during some riots in California, Korean people who, from what I'm told, have like a great love of guns and such, they went like onto the roofs of the shops that they owned and they would literally shoot rioters coming by, and they apparently had some rather strong anti-black biases, and it's this very bizarre mentality that went into it.
Yeah, but you
But
get the same thing in this country. An awful lot of Caribbeans don't like people of South Asian heritage. They feel that they're being exploited because the prices in small shops are higher than they are in supermarkets. There's an awful lot of Caribbean people that do not like Asians.
really,
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
we're saying like
Now you will still
Afro-Caribbean
no,
or
but I still hear derogatory names for South people from South Asia used. I only ever hear them used by black people these days.
huh? I mean, maybe it's the context of growing up in a very different, in like you say, an integrated environment. I never picked up on anything to that effect, and you had, I mean, maybe it was because you literally had sort of black kids hanging out with South Asian kids. You don't want to, you probably wouldn't say that around each other, maybe.
Yeah, but you've not lived in a black area, have you?
No, I mean, funnily enough, now the area I'm in is like largely black. I mean, there's like a lot of black people around. It depends on how you define black. There were a lot of black people on my road. My neighbor was black growing up, but
Yeah, but there are black areas in London. You have
yeah,
places like Tottenham and Hackney,
yeah.
and what happens there is that these small shops are usually run by Gujaratis, by Indians, people of Indian heritage, and there's a lot of annoyance on the part of black people. They can't understand why it is that the Indians are getting on, why the Indians are running the shops and black people aren't. You never see small corner shops run by black people. You probably notice that.
I mean,
Independent shops are nearly always run by either white people or people of South Asian origin. And there's resentment amongst black people about it. They don't get it. They don't understand why this should be. It's the same thing with Koreans in America. It's the same thing. They have a grudge against people. With them, it's against people of East Asian origin. In this country, blacks have a thing about people of South Asian origin, Indians, Bengalis, Pakistanis. In America, it's people of East Asian origin. But it's the same thing. They feel cheated. They feel that they're not getting their share. Why is it that the shops are run by people from Asia rather than black people?
fair. I think there were black corner shops run by black people when I was younger. I can remember at least one in Tooting. But maybe Tooting is an exceptional area. That's an interesting consideration, to be sure. I mean, I don't doubt that there's a lot of black people who are quite racist. I mean, I know that there are a lot of South Asians who are quite racist, so it
Mm.
wouldn't be surprising. Yeah, they say binary thinking is it can conceal the checkerboard of racial progress and entrenchment, and it can hide the sort of complicated relationships of minority groups to the majority of society. And they give the example of newly freed slaves after the Civil War fighting against Native Americans, for example. The Seminoles actually, to me, are quite interesting in that regard, in that they were almost ahead of their time in treating freed slaves and Native Americans as a sort of as sharing a common struggle, which is quite interesting to me.
Well,
So yeah, in addition to pitting one minority group against the other, binary thinking can induce a minority group to identify with whites in in exaggerated fashion at the expense of other groups. And they give the example of early in California history, Asians trying to be declared white so they could attend schools for whites and not have to go to ones with blacks, which is interesting. I think there's a lot of stuff in recent years about Latinos, because the status of Latino has changed recently in the US, but also of sort of Middle Eastern, as to as to how those groups relate to white. Because Anna Kasparian of the Young Turks has pointed this out, that like different parts of the Middle East have that. I'm trying to think. Essentially, the more Muslim you are within the Middle East, the less white you're considered in the US. But Anna Kasparian, despite being from the Middle East, from Armenia, is not considered Middle Eastern generally in the US. She's read as a white woman. And I
it's
find it,
because it's because Arabs tend to be darker. You know, the further into the Middle East you go, the darker the people look. When you look at some of the Bedouin in places like the Sinai, their skins are as dark as Indians or Pakistanis. So yeah, they won't be taken for white. But Armenians, in addition to not being Muslim, the Armenians are Christians. They come from further north. They come from the borders of the Ukraine and the Caucasus. They're not. They don't look dark. They actually look white.
I mean, that's fair. An ethnic group I find very weird, and I can see some factors that would explain it, is Romanians. I've seen Romanians with such a wide variety of skin tones. And I mean, I guess there's going to be like Turkic groups and Saxon groups and sort of Dacian groups, like in terms of ancestry there. But it's very interesting to me that there's such a mix among
Yeah,
Romanians.
don't forget the Ottomans invaded Eastern Europe. Turkey actually occupied Romania, Hungary, and so on at one time. So you're bound to get darker skins there. It's a legacy of that.
To be sure,
Yeah, the
yeah.
Ottomans reached the gates of Austria.
Absolutely. And that actually gets on the topic of skin tone, like Anglocentric standards of beauty dividing Mexican and black communities. I remember I was shocked when I learned about light skin and dark skin being sort of even social media hashtags in the US. That really horrified me. Like, why? It just seems awful. Especially when I saw a video how on the origins of it, of how like a lot of light skinned slaves were allowed to do comfortable jobs or more comfortable jobs in the house, and dark skinned slaves were outside. It's like, why would you continue using this? It just seems so awful. It's not my community, but that's just an outsider perspective, I guess. And I find it quite cool that they had this term box checking for I guess the technicalities. Like, I mean, Elizabeth Warren is the prototypical example of this. Like, I'm technically Native American. Like, I've got this technical amount of blood quantum to be Native American, and therefore I am a minority. It's good to have a term to describe that, I think.
What do you mean by similar issues in the trans community?
So like, there's a couple of angles with it. So one of them is how it's a common talking point that radical feminists use arguing against trans rights, that oftentimes trans people coming out can be used by corporations to do this kind of box checking. So I think she may still be the case. The highest paid female CEO is a trans woman, and she was having the same salary, obviously, until she transitioned, and then because she has that same high salary that she sort of earned as a guy, when she transitioned, suddenly she's like a woman with the highest salary, and therefore she got that title and award. And so that's like we've technically got a woman, and even though like she didn't get that salary in spite of the difficulties of presenting as female in in society. That's one of the arguments, but there's also arguments about passing, right? Because for certain, especially heterosexual trans women like Kat Black, who is a popular trans YouTuber, who just people assume that she's cis and she fits into society. If she's going to be on some kind of panel for LGBT issues, she is technically LGBT, but she doesn't face a lot of the issues that most LGBT people face. She does face some, but not all of them. So it's a similar kind of thing. Yeah. So, and they also talk about how the black white or the binary thinking can cause it can encourage people to serve as tokens, because you can sort of, I guess, think of yourself as one of the good ones, one of the binaries. And there's a good few people who do that. Candace Owens, Jesse Lee Peterson on YouTube, very interesting people. And that's that point about coalitions they had talked about earlier. So we won't, I think, dwell on it unless there's anything particularly you want to add on all of this. So we can get on to critical white studies, which I think is quite interesting. So they talk about here race is not objective or biologically significant. Same as I said before, I think all that they're trying to say is that it doesn't map onto the categories, the biological
Well,
categories.
that's very much a debatable point. When he talks of contemporary thinkers, he's really talking about sociologists. Biologists and anthropologists tend to believe that race is an objective and biologically significant thing.
But
I was looking at Ali Ratansi's book, Racism, a very short introduction, and he talks about race as being, said most sociologists in the UK and many in the USA are convinced that race is a social construct. But then he goes on to admit that there's a great many academic anthropologists and biologists who still adhere to a biologically essentialist concept of race. And it's true. When Delgado says contemporary thinkers believe, what he means is people that think like him, sociologists.
I mean, I find this a bit confusing. Maybe I'm just not familiar with it because I didn't go into biological anthropology, but I did some biological anthropology in my undergrad because my bachelor's was in anthropology, and we learned about the history of the idea of race and how it works, and we learned about certain climatic biological effects like Allen's law, right? People at the closer to the equator are going to have longer extremities, and they'll generally be taller than people further away from
Mm.
the equator. So that there are some definite like biological and racial things, certain kinds of diseases as well.
Yeah, but it doesn't stop there. Black children sit up and walk and stand more quickly than white children. And that's cross cultural. That's the case in the Caribbean. It's the case with African Americans. It's the case in London. It's the case in Kenya. It
Huh,
happens to be the case that black children reach their gross motor milestones before white children.
that's really interesting. Huh,
There are
curious.
differences between black people and white people.
I think the key word there is significant, right? It's about
That is significant. If you start walking, running, and jumping earlier than other people, you're going to get better at it. And it might be significant from the point of view of looking at black athletes.
yeah, I can see that. That can certainly be the case. So, but the point is that that wouldn't be significant. I mean, again, athletes are very small minority of the population. So when we're talking about issues of, I guess, law and criminal issues and social policy, I don't think that
But
these.
reaching puberty earlier black children tend to reach puberty a year earlier than white children. That can make a difference. Having, for the boys, particularly having a surge of testosterone, it can, testosterone, high levels of testosterone are associated with all sorts of undesirable behaviour.
I
And of
didn't know
course,
that.
oh yes, black African Americans have on average 15% higher levels of circulating testosterone than white Americans. So there are plenty of biological differences.
Fair enough. I mean, I guess one would need to demonstrate that these differences cause very significant differences and discrepancies in
No,
life
no, no.
experience.
That's not what he's saying. He's saying race is not biologically significant, but constructed by social sentiment. Um, Reaching puberty a little bit more than a year early is biologically significant. Having high levels of testosterone is biologically significant. For one thing, it's part of the cause that African American men have the highest levels of prostate cancer in the whole world. So that's biologically significant.
I get so like how are we defining biologically significant for?
I don't know. How do you think he defines it?
So I think when he's saying biologically significant, he's saying significant enough to justify the categories, the social categories that are supposed to be associated with them. I think that's what he's trying to say. So I mean, as an example, oh goodness, I cannot remember the name of the philosopher, but there is a trans man philosopher who describes himself as like a political woman because the biological difference of natal females having a uterus and all the rest of that, and therefore being affected by abortion law, all of that stuff is biologically significant in relation to social issues and abortion law. Whereas I don't know, the fact that natal females on average are shorter than natal males, in that context, it's not significant to the abortion issue, because the category in question is not how tall people are, it's which people can give birth or not. And I think that's what they're saying here. So when they say biologically significant, I think he means that these differences in most areas of life aren't the main reasons or aren't good enough justification for the categories that we have and for the treatment of the different racial groups that we have. If you get what I'm going with this.
I see what you're saying. I'm not sure that I agree, but yes, I see what you're driving at.
I mean, it's a lot of people have commented on the videos that my reading of this is always very charitable, and I guess that's of course true. So, and I do think you've got a point that I could very much believe that Delgado, who I'm fairly sure a lawyer, right? Delgado,
Hmm.
yeah, not having looked too much into the biology of these things, would naturally dismiss these things as significant. But
But
I
Bella, if he hasn't looked too much into the biology, why is he saying that it's not biologically significant? I'm not a biologist, and he's not either. But if he hasn't looked too deeply into it, how come he's able to say categorically that race is not biologically significant? I don't get it.
well, I think
It'd have better to skip round that. I would have thought if he hasn't looked into it.
well, I mean, because I can't remember from my the modules I did on biological anthropology, race being like I should say the racial categories that we have of like white black being treated as especially useful in studying like the biology and the paleopathology of ancient peoples. But I mean, there are definitely studies done on things like genetic markers to trace ancestry in the past and things like this. So yeah, I think one can say that the differences are not significant enough to justify the policies. And I guess I am repeating myself here, but I think that once you know that, I don't know, differences in IQ maybe aren't significant enough to justify differential educational outcomes, in the face of the socioeconomic factors that
What do you
influence.
mean justify educational outcomes? It's not sufficient to justify segregation in education, if that's what you mean.
Yeah,
No, of course,
yeah, yeah, no,
there,
exactly.
there could be no possible reason to have segregation or to discriminate against anybody on ethnicity from an educational establishment.
Mm.
But that's the case whether or not there's a difference in IQ. That's a matter of common justice. That's a matter of natural law.
Yeah, well, I mean, and from my understanding, the Danes during the Nazi era and like the 1940s and 30s had funnily enough, a similar view on race to the Nazis, but just slightly different in that they thought that racial differences are real and that they believed in an Aryan race, but they sort of had a paternalistic view that the Aryan race should like help out other races to improve in life. So yeah, I mean, I would be repeating myself here, but I think that when he says it's not biologically significant, he means that the categories, the social categories, are not used as biological categories in science, I think is what he's trying to say. Which I can say from having studied like biological anthropology at university recently is that certainly is true that anthropologists don't talk about like white or black races, but they talk about populations and climatic zones and such like
Of
this.
course.
Yeah.
Yeah, but there's a slight problem here. He's written a book which is being used as a textbook at universities, and it's not clear what he means. So that's a bit of a problem, isn't it? He states categorically race is not biologically significant, and we're having trouble working out what he means by that. So I think he could have made it a little clearer somehow.
Yeah, I mean, I would have liked a footnote here with like this is some meta-analyses on how race works biologically and what effect it actually does have. I would have appreciated that, to be sure. So let's go on then for the time being, because the matter of critical whiteness and whiteness I find very interesting. And I put that note there that race is much more complicated than just or even mostly the biological, which I think we'd all agree with, that it's definitely much more complicated than a matter of biology because the social categories don't match on neatly to the biological categories. So I highlighted this quote addressing the question of exactly who is white and why. It involves examining what it means to be white, how whiteness became established legally, how certain groups moved in and out of the white race, passing, like the one drop rule, the phenomenon of white power and white supremacy, and the array of privileges that come with membership in the dominant race.
And
So,
ironically, a lot of black militants now are adopting things like the one drop rule and using them, which is absolutely, you know what the one drop rule is.
yeah, yeah, but why don't you like explain it for those of us who, well, yeah, anyone who hasn't heard of it? It's the one drop
Sure.
rule.
Okay. The situation is that a lot of states in America, particularly southern states, actually adopted laws in the 20th century classifying anyone who had any black ancestor as being black. So even if your great great grandfather was black, that made you black, and which is absolutely absurd. But it's being used now by black activists because you know the business about Queen Charlotte being black. The suggestion that she was Britain's first black queen.
No.
Oh, you're obviously behind the times. Did you hear of a Netflix series called Bridgerton?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
Right, they had a black woman playing Queen Charlotte in that, and the reason is that there is a myth being put forward by black activists that Queen Charlotte was actually black, that she was Britain's first black queen. If you Google Queen Charlotte, Britain's first black queen, you'll find that it's a whole thing. It's all across the internet on all sorts of sites. I'm surprised you haven't heard of this. The reason is that conceivably, 500 years before she was born, one of her great ancestors, a Portuguese fellow, might have had an affair with someone from North Africa who might have been black. And the theory is that that makes her black. So that's the one drop rule being used with a vengeance in the modern world by black activists.
I see. Right. Um, I mean, yeah, I don't personally like the idea of the one drop rule. And the one drop rule, I think, comes up a lot with the sort of box checking technicalities that we encountered before. This idea that we'll establish this rule, whether it's a one drop rule or any other kind of rule, for these are who is and isn't a member of the minority group. And anyone who technically meets these standards, we describe as a member of the minority group. And when we describe them as a member of the minority group, we imply that they experience most of the things or a lot of things in common with other members of the group. Which, in the case of like white passing individuals, isn't. I mean, maybe this is controversial, but I think that somebody who is white passing, for most intents and purposes, and in most relevant conversations, is white. And to be fair, for the most part, they don't, sort of, to my knowledge, describe themselves as not as not white or as like a minority in those circumstances. Like Elizabeth Warren saying that she's Native American and getting, I think she got some kind of scholarship based on that during her education. I think that's a minority of cases. And I don't think it's good form when people do that. But yeah, I mean, I don't like it when black people do it either. I don't think the one drop rule is a sensible rule to have. I can understand some of the impulses that might make people like want to do it, especially if you think about segregated communities in the US, because somebody who say has is mostly white looking or white passing. It came up in discourse recently. This rapper called Logic, who looks very white, but considers himself like mixed race and half black and such lots. Even though they may visibly look very fair, they may be in a community that's very black and so have a lot of that in their upbringing and therefore be considered part of the group more. I think a similar thing is true with Rashida Jones, who I didn't know was considered black until I was told. Honestly, I didn't know what's her name. Who's Harry's Prince Harry's girlfriend or sorry wife?
Oh, she doesn't look black at all. No, you wouldn't guess she was black. She's got freckles. She's got fair skin. No, no, you'd never guess in a million years she's supposed to be black.
I mean, yeah, like I thought it was one of those. What's the the sort of salmon women with like the hats at these horse racing things? I just got that impression. But yeah, no. So I think that I think with all of these things, like realistic expectations and life experiences are much more important than the technical categories of this is people are in XYZ group, like because of a one drop rule or whatever have you. So yeah, I don't love that one drop rule personally. I highlighted this also in the semantics of popular culture. Whiteness is often associated with innocence and goodness because I think it's a bit of a cheap shot, like because brightness
You're right.
everywhere.
It's
Yeah,
light. This is light and darkness. It's not
yeah,
black and white.
yeah.
Yeah.
Darkness and blackness connotations of evil and menace. I mean, also, I mean, this was something I found very weird growing up because with some very rare exceptions, few people's skin actually looks black. It's brown. Like it's not the same as darkness.
Mm.
It's something that I've always disliked. Funnily enough, when I was until I was about 10ish, I actually thought that Jesus was black because, and I found out why. It's because at one point when I was young, there was this big picture of a deacon, a black deacon, and he sort of had a halo and a bunch of light, and the picture looked like Jesus. And when I was young, I'd walked into sacristy and seen that and thought it was a picture of Jesus. So I just assumed Jesus. I mean, to be fair, it means brown. Like, no, we're not going to do that. Homogenizing racialism thing. But yeah, but this is, I think, a more interesting point. Whiteness is also normative, but I need to clarify that normative is different to like statistically frequent. So obviously, in a country like the UK, where white people are a significant majority of the population, to some degree, you turn on the TV, most of the people are going to be white. Yeah, you'd have to go out of your way to make it not the case. So I wouldn't regard something like that as discrimination. And later on, they mention an author called Peggy, I think Peggy McIntosh, who sort of implied that in a way that I don't like. But my point is that normative is different to statistically frequent in that it also brings with it moral values. So,
Mm.
like, whiteness is more common, and traits associated with whiteness are good traits, is the
I
issue.
don't know about this business about science fiction movies portray extraterrestrials
Yeah,
with minority-like features and skin colour.
I even said it's debatable. I mean, yeah, like, I mean, there's a lot of stuff with anti-Semitism and the witch trope and how that ties into
Oh,
anti. Yeah, but yeah, no, I'm sorry, just like aliens. No, they don't look like black people. Oh my god, one of
what
my
he's thinking of, I think, is the Predator. Did you ever see a film with Arnold Schwarzenegger as Predator?
yeah, but isn't that like it looks
It's
like a
got
bike helmet?
dreadlocks. No, no, no. The Predator, the alien, has a lot of coils hanging down behind. And some people have said that that's supposed to be dreadlocks. He's supposed to be conjuring up the image of
No,
a raptor.
no way.
No, no, seriously, no, no, no. I've heard this said, and I think that might be what Delgado's talking about here.
No, I mean, if that is, that's such a stretch. Like, no, I'm sorry.
Yeah, well,
I
if
mean,
you look it up, if you Google
definitely.
Predator and dreadlocks, you'll find a whole load of stuff about this.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, I don't think you're. I'm just like that. That's a ridiculous. Um, that's a ridiculous leap. Oh wow, you're right. Predator
Oh
dreadlocks.
yeah.
Jesus. Um. Okay. Right. Well, yes.
Moving
Um.
swiftly on.
Yes. It was one last thing. It reminded me of one of my favorite tweets in the Mr. Potato Head Twitter discourse. There was a tweet that was like, "Mr. Potato Head is a disgustingly racist depiction of a black man." And his response, "Stop." Oh man. Um. So yeah, this bit and the appeal below, the case study below, I found so interesting about how like the U.S. court literally adjudicated who is white and who is not, and they say how judges developed two tests, science and common knowledge, to decide these questions. And I assume science must be something to do with like a biological measurement, and common knowledge, like they just look at a person and be like, they're white or they're not.
Yeah, to anthropometry. You theoretically you can measure the side of the head and the length of the head, and then divide one by the other and come up with skull. The cephalic index and so on.
Yeah. Um, and then they brought up, and granted, this is 1922, so I believe the US has moved on a good deal in the literal almost 100 years since then. Um, but they talk about how this was the example of Takao Ozawa, who was a Japanese man who had resided in the US for 20 years, went to university, so went to high school there. He went to university, raised his children in the US, and he was not allowed to become a naturalized US citizen because and they said the reason why is because the appellant is clearly of a race which is not Caucasian, which I found really interesting as a way of almost like defining that the quote unquote Caucasian race it is linked to American citizenship. I found that really interesting.
To be fair, the Americans had a big thing going on not letting Jews in as well and foreigners generally, even white people, that they had very strict immigration rules. So this wasn't just directed against people who weren't Caucasian.
But I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. They talk below about here about the Irish Jews and Italians, and but they were allowed in, weren't they?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
They weren't actually regarded as non-white.
Yeah, I've heard this particular thing contested, especially on the level that they may have been treated differently, and with a
Yeah,
degree
of
of
course. Yes,
discrimination.
of course. But people were prejudiced against, and there's no denying that. People thought the Irish were dirty and the Jews greedy and the Italians crafty. That's a different thing from regarding people as being non-white, though.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I can test that personally. Because from the other side as well, I hear some people arguing that the treatment of the Irish and the Jews and the Italians was similar to African Americans. I was like, no, no.
No.
It's like how people say like indentured. They had white indentured servants in the U.S. and
Yeah,
that
no,
was the
no,
same.
no. Those are completely different.
Yeah, yeah. So they talk about how, based on the history of these groups, whiteness to a degree is shifting and malleable. I think Latino is a more interesting case in that regard because on the visuals, right, a lot of people who are called Latinos are in fact white, and Hispanic as well. I mean, Hispanic as a category is a linguistic category and not a racial or
Oh,
biological or social
yeah.
category. Yeah, but over the years in like Western countries, the idea of Latino has come from like a white image to a brown image, I think, and they talk about this a bit in here as well. So I think that would have been a better example to show how whiteness is sort of shifting and malleable. But yeah, so they talk about how they contrast here an argument which I think is very important of how essentially white supremacist organizations are racial solidarity organizations. And people might often ask the question, well, why is racial solidarity with white people problematic and with black people it's not? And I guess I would say that with black people it can be. Like there's this organization called Black Hammer, and you may have heard of them. They've gotten in the news recently because they tried to buy land and make like a black ethnic little city state in the US,
Mm.
and from what I've heard, and they're absolutely awful people. Like they loads about Holocaust jokes and terrible stuff like this. They're just awful, awful people. So there's that. So it can. I say that it can be bad for minority groups to have social solidarity. I'm certainly not one of these people who think that minorities can do no wrong. God no. But the point that they say here is that most people will see that in those cases solidarity is a natural and proper response to social pressures. It's necessary to form into a group for political advocacy. But by contrast, the argument would be that for white identity groups, white people in the US and the UK are not under the same social pressure. So the question then becomes, what is the motive for solidarity and group organization then? And oftentimes it seems to be attacking minorities rather than much else. And I think that's a reasonable way to view the difference between the two, because I understand how it can look like critical race theorists are saying that racial solidarity is okay for minorities but not okay for whites. But I think the context is important. That, yeah. So they talk a bit about Obama's thing, but I mean, we all know that there was a lot of yeah, rather racist opposition to
Sure.
Obama. So they talk here about white.
So this bit here, the interviewer, if you go for a job interview, the
Yeah,
interviewer may ask the white candidate to play golf later. I've never heard anything like that in my entire life.
yeah, I found that very
Go to the job. You don't ask them to go play golf afterward, do you? It's really weird.
yeah, that feels like a very. I mean, maybe in some like really
No,
fancy
I've never
jobs.
heard of this in my whole life.
Oh, neither have I. But that's one. I feel like a lot of the times these like imagine scenarios that they bring up are, they rely very heavily on stereotype
Imagination.
stereotypical scenarios of
And
how these
yeah. Yes, it's
interactions
got
play
the
out.
idea of the white executive, something, from Mad Men or something.
Yes. I put a note for white privilege that I prefer to talk about it rather than like a myriad of social advantages. I prefer to talk about it as an absence. So white privilege is not having certain disadvantages which minorities normally incur, which I think is much more because that makes it much more intelligible with intersectionality, because people then say, well, I'm poor and I'm white, or I'm working class and I'm white and I've struggled. And when you describe it as white privilege, it sounds weird saying that a poor white person still has white privilege. But saying that they don't have extra disadvantages, I think makes it's easier to talk about it in those terms. You may have heard of Peggy McIntosh, and this
Mm.
her, yeah, I think you've talked about it in the video. I don't like this list, especially because a lot of the stuff that she says, it sort of confuses normativity with frequency. The fact that white people, I think one of the things that if I go to, if my students are likely to be taught by people who look like them, and I'm like, okay, yeah, but that's likely to happen statistically. So yeah, we can both agree. I think that Peggy McIntosh's list is a bit
Mm.
silly. Oh, and they brought up affirmative action, which we call positive discrimination in the UK. Do you have any like thoughts on this matter? Because I'm sort of ambivalent on it.
I don't really hold with it. It's you probably saw. I did a video about a week ago. The BBC have been advertising jobs only for black people, only for minorities. A lot of universities have got grants and bursaries only for black people. It creates ill feeling.
Yeah, I mean, I'm literally really torn on it. So part of it, I think, also is that it's different in the US and the UK, because in the US, I didn't know about this until I looked into the issue. Like with university, legacy admissions is more of a thing. So if a family member has gone to that university, they're
Yeah,
more likely to fit. Whereas
yeah,
in
yeah,
the
yeah. Not
I've not
applicable.
I've not heard of that over here. I don't think that's the case here.
It's
And so the point is with affirmative action for university admission in the US, if you've got good universities with like only white people having been admitted before, it's harder for black people to break into that. Whereas if you give a few black people in early generations places there, then their children can be more likely to get in, and it sort of gives them more of a chance.
Yeah, but that militates automatically against people of Chinese origin because they have to rig those figures. Well, once you start doing that, any increase in fairness to one group leads inexorably to an increase in unfairness to someone else. So at Harvard and Yale, they're currently being pursued under the Civil Rights Act because they have a policy of restricting Chinese. They've got a quota for Chinese people, and they won't let too many Chinese in because they want to make room for blacks. So it discriminates against Chinese people.
Correct me if I'm wrong, would it not also allow for a greater percentage of white students to attend as well?
No, it reduces that as well. They say it's racial balancing. They've decided they've set aside 15% of admissions at Harvard for black people, 5%, I think, for Latins, and a certain number, 25% for Chinese. So it's bad for everybody.
Right. I mean, like, it's kind of interesting that 25% Chinese, but I should say that a university, especially like a big prestigious university like Harvard or something, they're more international than the countries they're in. So I guess having a 25% Chinese ratio makes a bit more sense because of the world population. China is going to be so big.
No, no, no. It's straightforward racial balancing. They don't just do the admissions on academic ability; they do it on characters as well. So they've discovered, or the way that they work it is that they say that they're assessing the characters of the students, who's likable, who's courageous, and so on. And it just so turns out that when they're assessing the Chinese characters, they turn out to be cowardly and unlikable,
Well, that's, yeah, I mean, especially if that's the reasons
like
they're
Fu
giving.
Manchu in the Sax Rohmer stories.
I mean, I don't like that if that's what they're doing,
No, I'll
frankly.
see. I can send you some links on
No,
this, whether you find it interesting.
I mean, I'm sure. Yeah, I would certainly agree that like affirmative action such should be phased out, and yeah, it can definitely cause some problems. A part of the problem I have with it also is that, and this is mostly a problem of backlash rather than intrinsic to the policy itself, but it can, I fear, cheapen the success of minorities who do succeed, because the impression becomes to some people that they only got that position because of an unfair advantage and not
Sure, they'll
because.
get known as a diversity person. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, but taking that negative, I guess, image and accepting some of that unfairness as a means of addressing unfairness is something that in academia, Daniel Padilla Peralta has talked about in his talk on and in his research on how to diversify the humanities and particularly the field of classics that he's in. And he says that at the end of the day, some essentially privileged white people are going to have to relinquish seats unfairly. And he says that journals are going to have to, in order to establish a precedent of listening to more black scholars in the field and other minority scholars, there is going to have to be a period, he argues, where white papers unfairly get published less often, even regardless of merit. And part of his argument, which I won't say is unconvincing to me, is that yes, it's unmeritocratic, but the history that created the present conditions are also unmeritocratic. So it's no more unmeritocratic than what has happened before. It doesn't necessarily make it right, but it might be necessary, is his argument. Because his argument is that unless actual steps are taken to reduce the proportion of privileged, to reduce the number of seats at the table for privileged white scholars in the field of classics, there won't be enough space for minority scholars to break in. And even if those seats at present are assigned on merit, some of those seats are going to have to be less meritoriously taken away and given to other scholars as an act of increasing diversity in the field.
It depends what you mean by privileged white scholars, I suppose. I mean, by privilege, you mean they didn't get the highest SAT scores, the Scholastic Aptitude Test, to get into top universities, or they didn't get the top A levels to get into Oxford or Cambridge. How are they privileged?
Well, I mean, so it would be not experiencing those same disadvantages of having people assume that you're less interested, less invested in teaching a classical curriculum because of this idea that it's linked to Western heritage and the idea that this is an intrinsically white thing.
Some white people have that. I know white working class people that have experienced that. That people have assumed that because of their background, because they are working class, that they're not going to be the ones that will, be keen on Latin and so on. That's not particularly just a racial or cultural thing.
Well, I should, because I think that it should be accounted for class as well. I don't think it should only be racial groups. And Padilla is talking about that as well. He talks about female scholars being disproportionately represented, underrepresented in the field, LGBT scholars underrepresented in the field. He talks about a need for diversity of various kinds, not just along the lines of ethnicity. And in academia in particular, scholars from the sort of third world, so from.
So why is there a need? I can understand a desire or a wish to have the diversity. Why is it a need?
Well, his idea is that the need to make the field of classics diverse. It's
Why is
that these.
there a need? I don't get it. Why is there a need to make the field of classics diverse?
Well, it comes down to a matter of values that the people who are in the field of classics want their space to be one where all voices can contribute to the discussion, is what he'd say. I think he would say.
But if people in the field wanted that, then presumably they would go about doing it.
Well,
It sounds to me as though they don't want it.
I mean, they are to some extent. So, the American Classic Society, I believe, is where he gave this talk, and he was opposed actually by a woman who called him a diversity hire. Basically, she said, "I would like to think that you were hired on the basis of merit," implying that she didn't think that he was hired on the basis of merit. And the man's name is Dan L. Padilla Peralta. For anyone who is interested, he's really famous. Yes, here we are, the Society for Classics Studies in 2019. He's where he gave this paper, and he was challenged on it by one person. But the point is that that person who challenged him seemed to be opposed by a majority of the room. So it seems like most of the classicists there thought that Peralta's ideas were useful and worth taking up. So it's just a matter of like if people who are doing classics feel like diversity is something they want to value and actively promote, that's what they need to do. His argument, and I can see some degree of value in it, in part because in the field of classics in particular, but like medieval history and such, for a very, very long time, as Daniel Padilla Peralta, but also Mary Beard and other scholars have pointed out, the contributions of minority scholars have been there but underappreciated. And because of the matter of different perspectives, they can maybe bring a new light to texts which have been read over and over and over again. Like the Loeb Classics Library fits on a bookshelf or a couple of bookshelves, and essentially like white, mostly wealthy, mostly Christian, Western men have been analyzing these texts for 500 years and deciphering their hidden meanings. It's not that a rich, white, privileged man today couldn't come up with something new to say about these texts. It's just that I think that because we haven't listened very much to people from a different perspective, there's more to say. There may be things that, and this is definitely coming out right now with female translators, because recently the first woman to translate the Odyssey was published her translation, and people say how that's really different to how a lot of men have translated it before. And so that's the argument for why it's beneficial to make the field of history more diverse, because frankly we get to see things in different ways that we haven't been seeing before. But I'm sympathetic, I should say, to the idea that it's going to hurt and it's going to really suck for people to be denied places when they've done good work. It is going to suck. There's no way around it, I think. Yeah, so very heavy stuff. But yeah, one last thing I think I want to point out. They said they had this bit about if we take this perspective that racism is perversive, systemic, and deeply ingrained, no white member of society seems quite so innocent. I don't like this because I don't want to put it on individuals. And I disagree with this because white individuals are innocent, because individuals can contribute to the actions of systems, but it's a drop in the ocean, quite literally. Well, not literally, but yeah. And people who would turn that around and go to individual people and be like, you're responsible for all of this, is just shitty behavior, I think. So yes. And one last quote that's very interesting is that one aspect of whiteness, according to some scholars, is its ability to seem perspectiveless or transparent. Whites do not see themselves as having a race, but as being simply people, which I think is true for the most part. Some of it, though, is not entirely, I think, malicious. I mean, there's a lot of things that I assume everyone in the English-speaking world does or says, and then I realize that it's only English people or only Londoners who say them. So sometimes that's a matter of perspective. But certainly I think there's this idea that minority races they are racial groups and white people aren't races, and also that they're political, not racial, and that's not true. There's similar developments in the field of gender studies, because similar thing persisted for a long time, where women were gender for a very long time until the 1990s, when Raewyn Connell, really fascinating person, because she's a trans woman who lived as a man and wrote a book studying masculinities while living as a man, and then transitioned and wrote from a different perspective. Absolutely fascinating. But the point is, like, her work was some of the first that was like, well, hey, men are also a gender. So what's the deal with men? And this is part of the reason that I like this kind of critical theory, because there's really interesting questions in all of that. That if we accept the perspectivelessness, if we accept the invisibility of whiteness or of masculinity, we don't get to ask those really interesting questions, which, yeah, we
Yeah.
get to now. So they talk a bit here, and this it's almost like an addendum, this bit about Latino and Asian feminism
Mm.
and LGBT. But they basically talk about some of the contributions to critical race that Latinos have done, which is odd because they have this bit about Asian, but they've been talking about Asian Americans up until now as well with the Japanese. I don't know why they've put this as a almost like a footnote, but they talk about how nativism against Latinos, it increases in hard times of hardship, which I think is fair. Well, not fair, but is understandable and intuitive because, when resources are limited, groups are going to get more. They're going to look at each other more harshly. And they talk also about the model minority myth, according to which Asians are the perfect minority group, quiet and industrious, which, okay, with intact families and high academic aspiration and achievement.
People say that in this country about the Gujaratis, about the Patels and so on.
Yeah, yeah. South Asians are definitely the
Mm.
idea of the model. I think that's with us. That's linked to our idea of empire, isn't it? Like almost
Mm.
like they've been here for longer.
Yeah, yeah.
They figured it out. Yeah, and they point out how it's an unfair myth to sub Asian groups who are more likely to be poor. And here's one thing also is that with a lot of it, especially East Asians who come over to the US, they get in because they're wealthy and their parents are like highly skilled workers and they come in. It's sorry, I find it really stupid. Like the idea that the characteristics of Asians help them succeed in America, and that's why they're a model minority when they had these characteristics before they came to America. Drives me mad. Shockingly, the children of doctors coming into the US do all right for themselves. Who'd have guessed it, you know? Yeah. So I found this one funny. The idea that Americans are too successful, soulless, humorless
Yeah,
drones.
yeah. Lovely.
God. But yeah, and they talk about sort of intersectionality stuff here, but they don't actually talk about any specific issues or too many specific issues here. But it's interesting just to remember that all of these racial issues if inflect differently for sexual minorities and for men and women, etc. Cool, and we've gotten to the end of the chapter.
Yeah.
Next week, we're getting onto criticisms of critical race theory.
Ah, should be interesting.
Yes, should indeed. Do we have any final thoughts on knowledge
No, I
construction in
don't think
Japan?
so.
Awesome, brilliant. Well, I think next week's going to be much more spicy. Thank you very much, Simon, for reading through this with me. Thank you for all of the viewers, and I hope all of you have a good day. Bye, everyone.
Bye.